This is Daybreak on Trust Television, and it's about time for us to talk economy. Now, World Bank has projected that Nigerian economy will grow by 2.5% in 2022, up from an estimated 2.4% growth in 2021. The global lender projection is below the 4.2 target set in the 2022 budget. Now, the bank in its January 2022 Global Economic Prospects report published on Tuesday said Nigeria's growth is projected to also strengthen 2.8% in 2023. It cited the rebound to higher oil prices as well as accelerated growth in the telecommunication and financial services. According to the report, global growth will decelerate from 5.5% in 2021 to 4.1% in 2022, then 3.2% in 2023. Now we'll be joined by the Managing Director, Afrinvest Securities Limited, Ayodeji Abo, virtually. But we have an economist and Governing Council member, Nigerian Economic Society, Dr. Tefa Abraham. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Zena. Thank you.
Yeah. So you're welcome to the program.
Thank you, Brian.
So I'm trying to find the relationship, because oil, that's crude oil now, contributes less to our overall GDP, but it brings in higher revenue. So to a layman now like me, how do we explain that? Because I believe if you have higher revenue, then you should have higher GDP. So how do you explain that?
Okay, thank you. One of the reasons the IMF, the World Bank projected that 2.5% growth, don't forget the World Bank projected 2.4 for 2021. Okay. So the only thing is that it still projects a higher growth for 2022, but slower compared to what Nigeria is projecting of 4.2. And one of the reasons the World Bank gave for that growth is crude oil price. And like you rightly said, crude oil generally is one of the highest foreign exchange earning exports of the country, but contribute less to our gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the Naira and Kobo summation of the goods and services produced in our economy, the 774 local government, 36 state plus FCT, quantified goods and services. So you can say that in terms of our domestic production, it will contribute less to the growth. But in bringing foreign exchange, it will be the largest. So that is a trick about that concept. So the difference between the IMF projection, the World Bank projection of 2.5% and that of our own economy of 4.2 is both of them still project that Nigeria economy will grow in 2022. It's just that the World Bank is staying more on the cautious part compared to the Nigerian estimation, which is more optimistic. Now, the World Bank is made up of 189 countries. Its role is to give credit and the World Bank is a global financial institution that gives credit or finance to these 189 countries to implement capital projects. The goal of the World Bank is to reduce poverty and then to strengthen, to enhance the implementation of capital projects. These 189 countries, they are represented by either Minister of Finance or Minister of Development, depending on the country. And they meet once in a year in an annual meeting that combines World Bank and the IMF. So our ministers of finance are part of the people who take that decision. In other words, they are aware of the decision. So like I said, in 2022, there's projection of growth. It's just that by the World Bank projection, we should be more on the cautious side. It's just like a one-way traffic. The Nigerian economy aspect for projection for 2022 puts it at 4.2. Yeah. So we are so sure that if it's a one-way, if it's a one service lane, that is just vehicles coming only to the right. The Nigerian economy, we are looking at the right, no vehicles, so we cross. So we are more optimistic of a 4.2% growth. But the World Bank is saying, even though it's a one-way coming road, let's still look left and right. Left is let's look at our insecurity. Exactly. Let's look at our economy being a fragile economy. Let's look at double-digit inflation. Let's look at all those inability to implement capital projects, high debt, high level of debt that's accruing. So World Bank is saying, let's look at all these things and be very careful as we plan for 2022. Otherwise, they don't see our growth attaining 4.2, but they still see a growth of 2.5% from 2.4%.
Isn't it logical that we, as Nigeria, we wear the shoe, we know where it pinches. We as Nigeria, we know how our economy is, we know how our internal issues and whatnot. Shouldn't we be in the right position to say, okay, this is the way our economy is going to go, this is the projection that we have?
Absolutely, Ibrahim, you are correct. And that's why I took a little time to explain how the World Bank works. 189 countries, Nigeria is part of it. So they meet annually through our Minister of Finance, which is also who is also a member. And when they meet in that annual general meeting, there's World Bank and there's IMF. These two institutions are called Bretton Woods institutions, started in 1945 after the Second World War, trying to rebuild. So another name for the World Bank is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And they give loans to countries to implement capital projects. So looking at our domestic economy, I assure you that we have Nigerians, we have Africans, just like I mentioned earlier, our Minister of Finance being part of the meeting. So they see all those projections as well. It's not that the World Bank just sits in their office in Bretton Woods or in Washington and work out these figures. We are economists. We are friends. Sometimes we will serve as consultants to some of this analysis to give market feedback. It's just like you and I sitting in Abuja, but we can analyze perfectly what's happening somewhere in Borno right now because we have reporters all over. So that's how the World Bank is. It aggregates data. The only thing is that many development partners, civil society organizations, and even many economists on the radical left, because economics too, we always argue, on the positive role of World Bank. Some people see the activities of World Bank as being damaging to economies. Exactly. But personally, I see the World Bank and IMF as institutions that are partners for progress. So when they throw their advice, we should pick it and throw in our decision box. We're not saying we should take their decision 100%, but we shouldn't ignore. And why they put our growth low, Ibrahim, just like you said, they are aware that our debt is rising. And debt servicing is almost competing with capital projects. If you now work out the ratio of debt to revenue, to be very difficult. And don't forget their mandate. They give out loans to countries for capital projects. The way they see our loans, our debt building up, especially from components they don't understand, like the loan component from China and things like that, they fear that in the long run, they may not even be able to fund our borrowing for capital projects. Even if they do, they fear our ability to pay back. Don't forget, Nigeria used to be classified as a low-income country. We have moved to a middle-income country. So you become more harsher as your child grow up, so that the person will learn how to take responsibility. So it's our economy. We know where the shoe pinches, but we should listen to advice. Just like our parents talked to us before we got married, to be careful.
Now, the World Bank also projected accelerated growth in telecommunications and financial services. Would you say we are on the path to achieving that presently? Yeah,
thank you, Zainab. Financial services, telecoms are major drivers of our current economic growth because of the ability to leverage on the digital economy space. Even in 2020, when there was global lockdown, COVID-19 shutdown, things like that, ICT was the sector that helped many sectors to grow. Any sector that was connected to ICT, telecoms, digital space was able to maintain its growth. So just like the report pointed out, so that it's a signal that if we want to help other sectors grow and remain on a positive trajectory, we must continue to sustain the telecom sector and financial services. But again, if these two sectors are driving growth, then we must find a way to connect other economies to it. I'm very happy that the government has finally reopened Twitter. Because one way for Nigerians to benefit from businesses through telecom is by allowing them to have access to their digital space for businesses, and then ensuring that we step up our effort on financial inclusion so that nobody will be left out, and so that our social investment programs can target low-income households very well using the financial sector. One thing is that even as we're innovating across our financial sector or across our financial space, it's important to do all those innovations through commercial banks. Otherwise, anything we are doing outside commercial banks will be frustrating CBN's ability to maintain price stability and ensure a healthy and stable financial system.
All right, so all these projections that we're actually making, all these economic projections, both the one made by the World Bank and, of course, the one made here in Nigeria, they're all tied to oil price, most of them, you understand. So, and we look at the current situation and then we try to see how the trajectory goes and then we make these projections. But what happens in a situation whereby those oil prices that we've hinged these projections on crash? Then what do we do?
Great question, Ibrahim. So that's why the Ministry of Finance, through the Budget Office of the Federation, representing the executive, works with the National Assembly, the legislature, to ensure that the Appropriation Act or the annual fiscal plan of the government, which is the budget, is premised on key assumptions. Currently, crude oil price is doing above $84 per barrel. And IMF even projects that crude oil price for 2022 may stay at 74. But if you look at the 2022 Appropriation Act, the crude oil price used for Nigeria's budget is 62. In case there's a drop, so, but your question is still on point, because if it drops below 62, they will be having a serious issue of fiscal crunch. So the concept of economic planning, especially on the fiscal side, is to choose a crude oil price benchmark that, by and large, having taken into consideration all the fluctuation and volatility in the international crude oil price market, it will not go below that 62. So while the price is above that 62, there's need for saving the excess revenue from crude oil earnings, so that should, in case it goes below, we'll draw up that savings and cover the gap between the actual price and the budget benchmark price. Then while we are doing all that, it's important to strengthen our economic reform to jack up or to be able to jack up or raise or shore up revenue from federal independent revenue, internal generated revenue of 36 states and 774 local government, plus the area councils in Lagos. You know, generally, because the crude oil price will always be dependent on international volatility in the crude oil market. But the one we can be sure of is our internally generated revenue that that's coming from our own domestic production, industries, firms, entrepreneurs. So it's important to continue to keep an eye on oil price, because we need crude oil price still, crude oil revenue to even diversify our economy. But it's important to move away from depending solely on crude oil to domestic, just like Lagos is doing. If you look at Lagos, the component of Lagos State revenue from Lagos Inland Revenue Service and Lagos State Internal Generated Revenue account for 77% of Lagos State revenue. The contribution from the federal government to Lagos is about 18%. So in case there's a shock to Lagos State, for example, from federal government, Lagos State can still survive. The same thing applies to our country. We must do our best to raise the non-oil component of our revenue, so that in case there's a shock from crude oil price, we can still survive. And support for Nexim Bank to ensure that we expand the capacity of our non-oil export to also earn the way crude oil price is earning is also very important.
Okay, so Dr. Tefa, we're going to get quickly back to that and look at other perspectives, you know, on the economy after this quick timeout.
Federal Capital Territory. The area council elections will be conducted on Saturday, February 12th, 2022. This is an opportunity for you to vote for the candidate of your choice for the positions of chairman and councillors of the area councils. Elections will take place in all 6 area councils of Amak, Abaji, Kwali, Gwagwalada, Kuje, and Buari. The FCT administration is working closely with INEC to ensure that the elections are conducted in a free and fair atmosphere. Are you a supporter of any of the candidates in the elections? Avoid showing your support through thuggery and violent behavior. All candidates contesting various positions should remember that only God gives power. Elections should therefore not be seen as a do-or-die affair. We must shun any form of violence, malpractices, vote buying, ballot box snatching, or anything that will make the election unfair. Be patriotic. Perform your civic duties. Vote for the candidate of your choice in a peaceful and orderly manner. Let all electorates exercise their franchise without intimidation. Voting is your right. Use it wisely. This message is from the FCT administration.
on Trust TV. Well, we're still talking the economy, and we have Dr. Tefa Abraham right here in the studio. We're talking about economic projections and what we have in store for 2022. So before we went on that break, we were actually talking about oil prices and how they affect all these projections. And you made mention of how when we do the projections, we actually give some leeway, some breathing space, just in case the oil price falls below a certain level. So just like you said, the projections were based on $62 per barrel. But if COVID-19 taught us something, is that unprecedented things can actually happen. At one point during the height of COVID-19, oil price was like zero. So what happens now if we made these projections that it's not going to fall below $62 per barrel, and then it falls down to like 15 or 10? How do we rearrange ourselves, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. Already, well, don't forget 2021 Appropriation Act was premised on $40 per barrel.
Okay.
And crude oil price is currently doing more than that amount. So it's important to save excess earnings on the crude oil price benchmark when the prices are doing well, because it might happen that the price will go below, just like you rightly said that COVID-19 taught us. For 2022, the Federal Ministry of Finance premised our crude oil price on $57 per barrel. But changes in prices in the international crude oil market space informed the National Assembly to raise it to 62. And if you look at the current price, it's above 84. So it is still within tolerable rates. The key point there is that we should do our best to save the excess that we haven't getting today, because crude oil sales is on a daily basis. When for 2022, we project 2021 rather, we projected that we'll be able to sell 1.88 million barrels per day. By November, we were doing 1.7 million barrels per day. So as of yesterday, 1.7 million barrels per day on the average must have been sold. So saving the excess from the difference is very critical. And the legislative framework to ensure that the executive arm of government adhere to that savings is another thing that we need to push forward for. Like the National Assembly can come in by ensuring that we actually have in place an excess crude account, a legislation for the excess crude account. It's possible to have it, but if there's no legislation, it will just be left to the prerogative of executive will. Ensuring that the savings from excess crude is kept so that it can be drawn from when there's a negative shock is the point that's really critical to addressing that vital question you asked.
Okay, one other thing, that actually bothers me in this projection is still hampering on the COVID-19 variant Omicron. As it states, in this projection, the threats from COVID-19 variants and rise in inflation, debt, and income inequality could endanger the recovery in emerging and developing economies. For Nigeria, we are still a developing nation, and how are we going to survive this?
The World Bank 2022 report already reduced the global growth rate from about 6 to 5, and for advanced economies from about 5 to 3. Where there's growth is in low income and emerging economies, including Nigeria, which the World Bank project that to grow from 2.4% to 2.5%. So for low developing and emerging economies, there's still prospect for growth. That report is only calling our attention to the fact that if the COVID-19 threat is not curtailed through effective global management and all countries putting their hands on deck to ensure that vaccination is adhered to and COVID-19 is just kept low from spreading, our partners that we're looking forward to getting foreign direct investment from may not be forthcoming. Our export may also not have the needed market. So even though our own economy is not hit directly by high debt rates, thank God for that, by COVID-19 and its many variants, we are still connected in a global economy through trade and investment. So it's important to still keep an eye on developments and events around COVID-19 and its variants and possibility of expanding. So what we can do from that knowledge is ensuring that we remain careful to COVID-19 protocols. This tiny advice from NCDC and World Health Organization and the federal government in general to adhere to COVID-19 protocol is important, because adhering to COVID-19 protocol now and scaling up vaccination rate has become a new investment signal for future investment.
Right.
Nobody wants to take his investment to a country that the investors are not sure of going back. Another thing we need to look at is insecurity, because the way our insecurity is going right now, global investors are seeing our economy as a fragile state or as a fragile economy. All these regional geopolitical tensions as well, they are all bad for investment. So it's important to ensure that whatever protest North Central has, Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, Southeast have, it's important to do it within tolerable rates to ensure that it gives room for dialogue. Violence, protests, very strong violent protests, we just turn back investment, even from the local government that Nigeria's billionaire richest men come from. So it's important to ensure that, just like Ibrahim asked earlier and said earlier, it's our country. We know where it pinches. Right. So however we are doing our protest or disagreement, let us keep it civil so that investment can still go on. Situations where you destroy people's investment because of protest, it will take time for them to recover. And the few people they've been able to employ, they have to lay them off. These are the tiny things that add to slowing economic growth. Just this week, the survey, 2020, the survey for medium and small scale enterprises came out, and it shows that that sector contributes about 3.7% to our GDP growth. So if we don't support small scale businesses, that woman who sells rice at Karakose on the road to remain open will be affecting their means of livelihood, thereby worsening our poverty situation. So the concept there is that it's important to ensure that we curtail every risk, external and domestic, which includes COVID-19 and its many variants, by just ensuring that we tame them by complying.
Okay, now we're still trying to connect with the Managing Director, AfriInvest Securities Limited, Ayodeji Ebo. If he's able to join us, we'll continue the discussion with him, but we'll still be here with Dr. Tefa Abraham. Now, as all these projections come through, where will the issue of food inflation stand?
Food inflation is one direct link from our macroeconomic analysis variables to how it affects the everyday Nigerian. And even though our inflation rate has maintained its decline from March 2021 to date, as of March, our inflation rose to about 18%. It's on the decline, but presently it's around 15.44%. The key point is that it's declining, yes, but it's still double-digit inflation. Double-digit inflation is bad for investment, bad for food prices, bad for anything. Double-digit inflation of 15.44% plus unemployment rate of 33%. That's about 58.4% misery index. Youth unemployment is even worse, about 40 to 44%. 40% plus 15, we are looking at youth unemployment about 60-something%, meaning 10 out of every 10 young people in Nigeria, including boys and girls, 6 may not have jobs. Now, food inflation, agriculture is still major, the major source of agriculture, of food supply is from rural markets, from villages, from communities, from wards. And the ability to maintain, to farm sustainably has not been that possible in the last 3 to 4 years because of insecurity. At a point, terrorists, as they've been termed now, even force farmers to pay something to them before they harvest. So all these things affect the supply of food to the city. And once the supply of food is less than the supply of demand, food prices will go up, in addition to the existing double-digit inflation. And rural farmers, who are mostly smallholder women farmers, are also wise now through extension workers. If it costs them a lot to move their harvest from farm to market because of bad road that they have to grapple with, they will also factor in the cost of that transporting their goods into the price of the food they are bringing to the market. And also they are aware of the periods that we demand for food the most. So what they do is that they try to average the supply of their goods by ensuring that they are able to sell when the demand for good will be higher than the supply, so that they can also be able to sustain their livelihood, take their children to good schools, pay for health care, and afford the everyday necessity of life. So for food inflation, the government has to do a lot to ensure that in the market, when you and I go to buy these goods, we see government policy as we say as we report in economic analysis, affecting the price of goods. But what the sellers do, the final seller of goods and farm harvest in the market, what they do is that, don't forget, they've already stocked rice, for instance, since February, since March. They are also buying rice in bags today. But when you and I go to buy, they will sell the old one first before the new one. And they'll sell the old one at the old price. So for the agricultural sector, because our economy is not yet a very smooth economy that demand and supply forces work smoothly, there's need for price regulation. The way government, I always push this point, the way government does with Department of Petroleum Resources, by ensuring that filling stations don't sell above the current price, or they don't adjust their scale to the detriment of people buying. Government needs to do the same thing with food prices. There needs to be a food price intelligence unit from the Federal Ministry of Agriculture to ensure that when they conduct periodic assessment or monitoring of markets to ensure that prices of goods are sold, or for food is sold at the appropriate price. There need to be deliberate effort to ensure that that is the situation. But generally speaking, food inflation is something that is still terrible. And like I said, because of the existing inflation and challenges of insecurity and farm harvest, bad road farm to market road infrastructure and the likes.
So quickly now, before we go, in just 60 seconds, there's this word that we've been hearing, I have been hearing, since I didn't know what it was, till I got to know what it is, what it means. Diversification. We've been shouting this mantra, we need to diversify economy, leave oil, do this, do that. Where are we on diversification?
Nigeria's story with diversification is a long one. Exactly. You and I, and I'm sure even our parents since secondary school have been hearing this diversification. Yeah. But don't forget, if you take a stock of diversification story from 30 years ago, that time there's no telecoms. From 20 years ago, that time no expanded banking service. From 10 years ago, that time agriculture is still largely a rural business. 5 years ago, so the idea is that diversification is slow. But if you take a stock of our economic history, we've made slow but steady progress. But the full meaning of diversification again, 20 years ago, Nollywood was not this big. 10 years ago, the music industry wasn't this big. 5 years ago, it wasn't possible for comedians and all those people in arts and entertainment to be this popular the way they are now. Interior decoration was not a big deal many years back. To be an ICT expert was not a big deal many years back. So this is how you take a stock on diversification. But for us generally, one area that's not benefited from the diversification story is manufacturing. Textile factories still down, manufacturing still not doing well. And if you look at our country's national development plan, these are some of the areas that the country's national development plan is still looking forward at recording very beautiful goals from 2021 to 2025.
Well, thank you so much for
coming
on the program,
thank you, Brian.
Dr. Tefa Abraham. He is an economist and governing council member, Nigerian Economic Society. We hope to have you next time as usual.
Looking forward. Thank you.